This first week, we want to look at special education in context, particularly people, concepts, and perspectives. Now, for topics in this week, we're going to start by defining some important terminology in the field of special education. We're going to look at the 13 disability categories and describe those, and we'll also look at some relevant statistics for each of those categories. It'll be important to pay attention to the historical perspectives of disability and education as well. One of the things that you want to do as a student is to pay attention to the objectives and make sure these are things that when you think you're finished, that you can do. So, for instance, the objectives for this module are that you should be able to define what exceptional children means, define disability, handicap, and developmental delay, as well as at-risk and special education. You also want to be able to identify the 13 disability categories that are recognized by the federal government. You should be able to distinguish and explain between prevalence and incidence. What is the difference between those two terms when we talk about disability, as well as describing the historical evolution of services for children and adults who have disabilities. You should be able to list the related services that are sometimes required by students with disabilities, and then understand and outline the differences between multi, inter, and transdisciplinary models. I also want you to be able to identify the key dimensions of universal design for learning. When we talk about classrooms today, we're really talking about a lot of diversity in those classrooms because classrooms are made up of diverse learners. It's important to remember that diversity comes in many forms. This can include disability, ethnicity, gender, specialized learning needs, and experience with schools and cultural norms. We want to remember that PersonFirst Language is essential for professionals. When we're describing people with disabilities, it's essential to focus on the person rather than the disability. Examples of PersonFirst Language might include a person who uses a wheelchair or a student with autism. Also, attitudes are powerful. Negative stereotypes and cultural beliefs about people with disabilities can impact the way people think and act, and that affects the experiences of people with disabilities in their everyday lives. A few of the terms that you're going to encounter in our first week. First is exceptional children. So this is designed to be an inclusive term, and it's frequently used by both general education teachers and special education teachers, and it's used to refer to individuals who differ from society or community standards of the socially constructed normalcy that people expect. It's also the language of the federal law and our state law here. When we talk about students with disabilities, it refers to exceptional children or exceptional children's services. It's important to recognize the difference in meaning and implication of the terms disability and handicap, even though people use those words interchangeably. A disability is a limitation or an inability to perform a task in a certain way. For example, a person might have paralysis of the leg muscles, they might have cognitive impairments, loss of sight or hearing, emotional disturbances, or learning difficulties or learning disabilities. But a handicap actually refers to the problems or difficulties that a person with a disability encounters because of their disability. For example, a building that isn't wheelchair accessible, or a building with braille signs posted far into a building where they're not really accessible, or the marginalization and discrimination due to negative social attitudes. So those are actually the handicaps when we're talking about the limitations of an individual or particular disorders or anything like that. We actually use that word disability. Are important terms. The first one, let's look at developmental delay. When we're talking about a developmental delay, lots of different states have different criteria for identifying what constitutes a developmental delay. For example, testing with standardized tests or comparing developmental milestones. Current legislation federally allows states to use the term developmental delay for children who are between the ages of 3 and 9. The use of specific disability labeling for young children is of questionable value. The term at risk. When we talk about children who are at risk, they're generally not identified as having a disability, but having a high probability of a disability manifesting due to biological, genetic, or even environmental factors. There are adverse circumstances or factors that can contribute to delays in learning or development, but it's not a guarantee. So when we see the potential there, we might refer to those students as being at risk for developing a disability. The next term is special education. Special education is a customized instructional program that considers materials, equipment, services, teaching strategies, all of those, and it's considered to, those things are used to meet the needs of a student with a disability. Special education is often conducted in the general education classroom, and not all students with disabilities will require special education programming. But students who do receive special education services will have what's called an individualized education program, or an IEP. Now, the term related services, these are services that are provided by professionals who may work with students with disabilities. Related services are an integral part of special education programs if the student requires them, and they'll be discussed throughout the semester. But an example of a related service would be speech-language therapy services or occupational therapy services. Now, the term incidence refers to the rate of inception, or the number of new instances of a disability that occur within a given time frame, usually a year. So we look at what's the incidence of a particular disability, and it's based on, say, 2020 or 2019. And then the term prevalence. This refers to the total number of individuals with a particular disability currently existing in the population at a given time. Discuss the federal categories of disability that are identified by the public law, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act of 2004. So we have 13 federal categories, and they are autism, deaf-blindness, developmental delay, emotional disturbance, hearing impairments, intellectual disability, multiple disabilities, orthopedic impairments, other health impairments, specific learning disabilities, speech or language impairments, traumatic brain injury, and visual impairments that include blindness. Now, once you have gone over those, this is really for the entire semester, once you have gone through this course, you should be able to identify some information about each one of these disability categories and what you would do in your classroom to help meet the needs of those students. But at the end of this module, I want you to at least be able to think about what those categories are, list them, and then identify what are the pros and cons to using labels to identify people in terms of education. Look at some universal design for learning, and this is actually something that we'll consider throughout the entire semester as we go through our course. And it's really something that you need to have a strong understanding of moving into your professional careers. But Universal Design for Learning, or UDL, is the concept that curriculum, instruction, and evaluation procedures should be designed to meet the needs of students by providing access to learning, not simply access to information. So learning materials and lessons are often designed to allow for flexibility and offer lots of different ways to learn and ensure that all children can achieve success. What we're going to be doing this week, as you go through the module and you're reading the articles, you're reading the text in the chapter, you're watching the videos, and really digging into the content that we have. Okay, so if you have questions, please let me know, and I will look forward to seeing your learning in your work.